During World War II, countless German prisoners of war and civilians found themselves deeply moved by the kindness and humanity of the American soldiers. The Americans didn't just win battles, they won hearts. In a time of destruction and division, compassion bridged the gap between enemies. Here are a few real-life stories that show how even in war, humanity can shine through. In the bitter winter of 1944, deep in war-torn Europe, a small town lay in ruins. Smoke rose from broken homes, the air was heavy with fear, and the people had almost forgotten what hope felt like. Among them was a little girl, cold, hungry, and too young to understand why the world had fallen apart. Then, one morning, the sound of engines echoed through the shattered streets. American soldiers arrived, not as conquerors, but as protectors. They brought food for the starving, shared their rations with children who had never tasted chocolate, and wrapped shivering villagers in warm army coats. One soldier noticed the town's silent church, its bell long broken by shell fire. With a few tools and determination, he climbed up and repaired it. When the bell finally rang again, its clear tone drifted through the cold air like a heartbeat returning to a sleeping soul. For the townspeople, that sound meant life was coming back. The little girl never forgot that winter or the kindness of those strangers in uniform. Even as she grew old, her eyes would light up whenever she heard an American voice. Her family says she often whispered, "If it weren't for them, we might not be here today." Remarkably, even decades after the guns of World War II fell silent, stories of compassion still echoed in unexpected places. In the 1980s, a quiet high school in America welcomed a substitute teacher who carried with him the weight of history and the grace of survival. Few students knew that the soft-spoken man standing before them had once been a German prisoner of war. During the war, his entire village in Germany had been destroyed, leaving him with nothing but memories of loss and fire. Captured by Allied forces, he was brought to the United States as a POW. But instead of bitterness, he found kindness. The Americans treated him not as a broken enemy, but as a man capable of starting anew. When the war ended, he was allowed to remain in the country that had once held him captive. He worked hard, earned a college degree, and built a life grounded in gratitude and peace. Years later, retired but restless, he returned to the classroom, not as a soldier, but as a teacher. Standing before rows of curious teenagers, he taught history not from books, but from his heart, reminding every student that even in the darkest chapters of war, humanity still had the power to heal. After the war ended, one American supply sergeant from General Patton's Third Army was given a new mission, not to fight, but to build. He was ordered to create a recreation area on an island, complete with ball fields and open grounds. To help with the work, he was assigned German prisoners of war. When he first went to the nearby prisoners of war camp to gather workers, he noticed something heartbreaking. The German prisoners were thin, weak, and tired. They barely had the energy to stand, let alone work. The camp guards were feeding them just enough to survive, fearing that if they were stronger, they might try to escape or cause trouble. The sergeant, however, saw them not as enemies, but as human beings. He spoke a little German, but didn't reveal it, and instead asked if anyone could speak English. A German officer, once an English teacher before the war, stepped forward to translate. Together, they gathered a small group of prisoners of war to begin the project. But by midday, the men were exhausted. Their hands trembled and their movements slowed. The sergeant realized something. If he wanted the job done, he had to help them regain their strength. So he drove to a nearby supply depot and asked what would happen to all the extra K and C rations left from the war. The workers there were happy to give them away. Soldiers weren't eating much of them anymore. He brought the food back, unloaded it into a building's basement, and quietly handed each German prisoner of war 2 full rations for lunch. The effect was instant. The men ate hungrily, their faces lighting up as energy returned to their bodies. That afternoon, their work transformed. They were faster, stronger, and more focused, but above all, grateful. Word spread quickly in the camp. The next morning, when the sergeant returned to ask for more volunteers, he didn't have to wait. Dozens of German prisoners of war lined up eagerly, ready to work, not out of fear, but out of respect and appreciation. That day, on a quiet island once scarred by war, Americans and Germans worked side by side, not as enemies, but as men who had finally rediscovered their shared humanity. That kindness didn't just end on that small island, it echoed across generations. Years later, one of the German prisoners who had once been treated with compassion by American soldiers returned home after the war. His son, now an elderly man, would later share a simple but powerful memory with his co-workers. He said that when his father finally came back from a U.S. prison of war camp, he didn't talk about pain, humiliation, or hatred. Instead, he spoke with deep respect. His words were few, but unforgettable. Make your goal in life to live in the United States. For a man who had once fought against America, that sentence said everything. The kindness of American soldiers had left such a mark on him that he wanted his family to live among the people who had once been his enemies, because they had treated him like a human being. It was proof that even in the darkest moments of history, a little compassion can outlive the war itself. There was another war. Prisoner who found hope in America. There was another war prisoner among the many German soldiers held in America. A young man captured and sent to a prisoner of war camp in Douglas, Wyoming. Life behind the fences was harsh, but the treatment he received from the Americans was far different from what he had expected. Instead of cruelty, he found humanity. The guards were fair, and the local farmers treated the prisoners with quiet respect. While working on one of those farms, he met a farmer's daughter, gentle, kind, and curious about the man from across the ocean. Their friendship began with small acts of kindness. A smile, a meal, a few words shared across the language barrier. When the war ended, he was sent back to Germany, only to face devastation. His home was gone, his family lost to the chaos of war. With nothing left, he thought of the one place where he had once felt peace, Wyoming. So he returned to the land that had once held him prisoner, but had treated him with compassion. There he found the same farm, the same girl, and a second chance at life. They married, and with determination, he earned a degree in engineering from the University of Wyoming. Later, he joined the Wyoming Highway Department, working proudly for the country that had once called him an enemy. His journey became a living reminder that kindness can rebuild what war destroys, and sometimes a man's greatest freedom begins in the most unexpected place. Back in the 1980s, a man who once fought for Germany worked quietly at Hughes Aircraft in California. Few people knew that decades earlier he had been a soldier in the final desperate days of World War II. As Berlin crumbled under fire, He and a small group of German troops waited in fear, unsure whether the approaching army would be American or Russian. The men chose him to scout ahead, his heart pounding as he ran through the smoke-filled streets. Every step could decide their fate. Then, in the distance, he saw it, the stars and stripes waving on an American tank. Relief flooded through him. He turned and ran back, shouting, "It's the Americans!" That, he later told his co-worker, was the happiest day of his life, because in that moment he knew he would live. To him, seeing the U.S. Army wasn't surrender, it was salvation. The kindness of the American people during World War II wasn't limited to the soldiers. It reached deep into the hearts of small towns across the country. In a quiet, backwoods town called La Couche, Florida, there stood a humble prisoners of war camp where German prisoners worked at a local cypress lumber mill. Among them was a fair-haired, blue-eyed teenager named Hans. To the local children, he wasn't an enemy. He was just another friendly face behind the fence. The little girls of La Couche, including one bright-eyed child who would one day become a mother herself, adored Hans. They would bring him homemade fudge, cupcakes, and sweets, giggling as they passed them through the wire fence. Hans always smiled and thanked them in his growing English, his accent softening with each passing month. Over time, the young prisoner became part of their small community. He would carve and paint tiny wooden finger puppets for the girls, each one unique and full of charm. 18 months later, when Hans finally left, he was no longer the thin, scared boy who had arrived. He had grown cheerful, healthy, and a little chubby, thanks to the kindness of those who saw beyond the uniform.